Hello again, and welcome back to another edition of the Wiccan Conservative. Today I have for you a court case that is heading to the Supreme Court regarding religious liberty and employee exemptions at work. This article is from the Desert News. What the Supreme Court said Tuesday about working on the Sabbath. 46 years ago, the Supreme Court issued a ruling that would dramatically weaken the rights of religious workers or fairly limit them depending on who you ask. What members of each camp agree on is that the decision was badly worded since it said employers need not grant religious accommodation requests that pose more than a de minimis, or in other words, trifling costs. To be more specific, this is directly from the EEOC website, Religious Discrimination and Reasonable Accommodation. The law requires an employer or other covered entity to reasonably accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices unless doing so would cause more than a minimal burden on the operations of the employer's business. This means the employer may be required to make reasonable adjustments to the work environment that will allow an employee to practice his or her religion. Examples of some common religious accommodations include flexible scheduling, voluntary shift substitutions or swaps, job reassignments, and modifications to workplace policies or practices. In this particular case, Gerald Groff, a former post office employee who believes his former supervisors had a legal duty to accommodate his request not to work on the Sabbath, has taken his battle over the 1977 ruling all the way to the Supreme Court. He and his supporters say the de minimis language has caused untold harm for more than 4 decades and needs to be overturned. Every factor leans towards overruling, said Aaron Street, who argued on behalf of Groff during oral arguments on Tuesday. The Solicitor General for the United States, Elizabeth Preglar, asserts that overturning the 46-year-old ruling would be an overreaction to a poorly worded but ultimately harmless phrase. Since 1977, courts across the country and the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission have thoughtfully applied Supreme Court's previous decision focusing on factors other than the de minimis line, she said. It is incorrect to say that there's not a substantial amount of accommodation happening, Preglar said, arguing that overturning the previous ruling would throw decades of meaningful case law into question. Now it's up to the Supreme Court to decide which of the two viewpoints should win out. At oral arguments Tuesday, the justices seemed to agree de minimis language was misleading, but disagree on whether a big move like throwing out the 1977 ruling would actually bring clarity to the decades-old debate. I'm not sure I can give you a full manual of how it's going to play out, said Justice Brett Kavanaugh at one point. Groff's case, like the one from 1977, centers on the Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which outlaws religious discrimination in the workplace. Under the statute, employers are prohibited from, among other things, refusing to hire or promote members of certain faith groups. They're also required to honor religious accommodation requests unless doing so would pose an undue hardship on their businesses. Groff, who previously worked as a rural mail carrier, says the Postal Service and the lower courts wrongly determined that his request to not work on Sundays triggered the undue hardship exemption, largely because they relied on the de minimis language from 1977. He wants the Supreme Court to overturn its past ruling and say only a significant difficulty or expense should count as an undue hardship. A key obstacle standing in the way of a potential win for Groff is the fact that Congress has had several opportunities over the past 4 decades to strengthen protections for religious workers and let the opportunities pass. The EEOC actual text under religious discrimination and reasonable accommodation and undue hardship reads, an employer does not have to accommodate an employee's religious beliefs or practices if doing so would cause undue hardship to the employer. An accommodation may cause undue hardship if it is costly, compromises workplace safety, decreases workplace efficiency, infringes on the rights of other employees, or requires the employees to do more than their share of potentially hazardous or burdensome work. At several points during the oral arguments Tuesday, justices questioned whether the Supreme Court should overturn a statutory interpretation that Congress has allowed to stand. Justice Brown Jackson, for example, wondered whether doing so would send the wrong message to the American public. I'm concerned that a person could fail to get in Congress what they want and then just come to the court and say, you give it to us, which is actually what's happening. Preglar said the most the Supreme Court should do is clarify how to apply the 1977 ruling to make it clear that the de minimis language should not be taken literally. She asserted that such a misstep has been an uncommon occurrence and that Groff's request for all Sundays off represents an undue hardship, even if you define hardship as a significant difficulty or expense. This is not some minor inconvenience to the Postal Service, she said. Like Groff's team, Preglar faced pushback over some of her assertions, most notably from Justice Samuel Alito. He questioned whether the EEOC and lower courts have really been performing as well in the Title VII cases as Preglar made it sound. If the de minimis language isn't causing an issue, then why did so many faith groups file Supreme Court briefs insisting that it needs to change, he asked. We have amicus briefs by many representatives of many minority religions, Hindus, Muslims, Orthodox Jews, Seventh-day Adventists. They all say the 1977 ruling has violated their right to religious liberty. Are they wrong? Alito said. Preglar responded that the faith groups are, quote, not accurately portraying the legal landscape and urged Alito and the other justices to consult the EEOC documents to learn more about the government's current approach to accommodation requests. As Kavanaugh noted, the Supreme Court will never come up with a perfect solution. However it rules, there will still be questions about what counts as an undue hardship, since all Title VII cases are context specific. What the Supreme Court must decide, then, is whether de minimis language from 1977 is confusing enough to warrant an overhaul of that past decision, or if it's better to use a simple clarification. If it goes the former route, then Groff will likely, at the very least, win the chance to re-argue his case in the lower court. Preglar warned such a step would cause widespread confusion, making it even more difficult for the employers, the EEOC, and judges to work out what businesses owe to religious employees. But Groff and his supporters have said it would be a step in the right direction since it would give religious workers more power to meet their faith-based needs. The Supreme Court is expected to issue its decision by the end of June. This case is particularly interesting for the simple fact it is going to be an experiment for individual rights. Of course, a business has the right to employ whom they see fit to do the job. They also need to worry about how they schedule their employees, how their employees conduct services for the business, and tiptoe the line on religious discrimination. This is pretty interesting considering that as soon as you allow one exemption for one group of protected individuals, there will be a follow-up of other protected individuals right behind them asking for the same exemptions. So this poses a huge conundrum to the employers of the business. Many individuals forget that independent businesses are also independent sovereign entities that have rights as well, and they are not there just for the discretion of the employees. So I think it will be very interesting to see how this plays out. As pagans, we should also be taking note of this court case because we have a lot of religious practices and we are part of the minority religious base that seems to go unnoticed in the country. According to the EEOC, religious discrimination involves treating a person, an applicant, or an employee unfavorably because of his or her religious beliefs. The law protects not only people who belong to traditional organized religions such as Buddhism, Christianity, Hinduism, Islam, and Judaism, but also others who have sincerely held religious, ethical, or moral beliefs. Religious discrimination can also involve treating someone differently because that person is married to or associated with an individual of a particular religion. Cases like Groff's that get elevated and put into the national spotlight always makes me think how many pagans are in the system fighting for their religious liberty and their protection under the law. But I guess we'll have to wait just a little while longer to see if any actual pagan people make it to the Supreme Court to fight for their religious liberty or religious discrimination. In the meantime, we need to bear in the back of our heads that employers are also protected by the law, and employees may not see the necessary hardships that they place on businesses. And the beautiful thing that I keep telling you about this country is that 99% of you are in free will states. That means that you can leave your job at any time and you can get a new job, which used to be one of the most attractive features of our country. But it seems that we are attempting to force our religious beliefs upon others through Supreme Court rulings under the guise of religious exemption and protection. So how far can an employee take a case for religious discrimination before it infringes upon the business's right to conduct their business as they see fit? These are the questions that I want you to ask yourself as you continue to follow this Supreme Court case with me. On that note, that's all I have for you guys today, and I will catch you on the next one.